Okay, let's dive into this. There's a new Nintendo console coming, what everyone's calling the Switch 2.
Mhm.
And yeah, tons of excitement building.
Huge buzz around it.
But I think for a lot of you listening, and definitely for me, the biggest question, the one that keeps coming up is, what happens to all those games?
Mhm.
You know, the ones you've bought for years on your original Switch.
Right. All those cartridges, the digital stuff, filling up your SD card, that's a big investment.
It really is. Years of collecting games, finding things you love. So do they come with you? Do they even work on the new machine?
It's totally understandable why that's the first thing people want to know. How does the new console handle what you already own?
Exactly. So today's deep dive, we're
Yeah.
really going to try and cut through the noise, get to the details we've managed to piece together. We've looked at, initial reports floating around about backwards compatibility.
Uh-huh. And some hands-on impressions, too. People talking about how older games actually feel on the new hardware.
Yeah. And also digging into what's happening with classic games, the retro stuff. The mission today. Let's figure out what you actually need to know about playing your Switch 1 games and those old favorites on the Switch 2.
Okay, let's start right there with playing original Switch games on the new console. Because Nintendo built up this, enormous library, over 15,000 third-party games just on the eShop.
15,000. Wow. That's a staggering number to think about making compatible.
It really is. So what's the early word on getting those to run?
How's it looking initially?
Well, looking at some of the early compatibility testing results that have surfaced,
Yeah.
there's a headline number. Around 2.5% of those third-party games are, right now, failing Nintendo's basic tests.
Okay, 2.5% failing. I mean, that sounds kind of low,
Mm.
which is good, right, on the surface anyway. But what did basic testing actually involve? Because that feels pretty important here.
Super important. And the key thing to understand from the numbers is the scope of that testing. See, out of that massive 15,000 plus game library, only about 21%, that's roughly 3,150 games, were tested beyond just like seeing if they'd start up without crashing.
Oh, okay, so most games, like 80% of them, were only checked to see if they boot.
That seems to be the case, yeah. Just that initial launch check.
So that 2.5% failure rate is actually split then. About 0.93% of the whole library just wouldn't start up at all.
Yeah.
And the other 1.6% failed after launching. But that's only from within that smaller group of 3,150 games that got a bit more attention.
That's the breakdown we're seeing. And you have to assume this basic testing is probably automated, not people actually sitting down and playing these games for hours.
Right, not like checking for weird gameplay glitches or anything deep.
Exactly. So the actual number of games that might have issues, maybe minor visual bugs, maybe performance drops when a person really plays them, that could definitely be higher. We just don't have that full picture yet. It seems likely Nintendo focused their more thorough checks on the biggest, most popular games within that 3,150 group.
Makes sense. What about Nintendo's own stuff? Mario, Zelda, all the big first-party games.
That side looks much, much better. Very positive, actually. Out of 112 first-party titles they looked at, pretty much all of them, 111 are compatible.
Okay, that's impressive. What's the one exception?
The only one mentioned is the Labo VR kit, which, makes total sense.
Yeah, that was built specifically for the original Switch screen, wasn't it?
Exactly. Tied to the exact dimensions and how the original hardware worked. So
Mm.
look, if your library is mostly Nintendo's big hitters, compatibility seems really strong right out of the gate.
Okay, so why isn't it just easy? Why can't they just make everything compatible? Is it not just simple emulation?
This is where it gets technically interesting. It's actually quite a bit more complex than just emulating the old hardware specs.
That
Well, on the original Switch, things like the graphics driver, the software that lets the game talk to the graphics chip that was often compiled directly into the game code itself.
Oh, okay. That's different from, say, a PC where drivers are separate system things.
Exactly. And plus, the shader code, the instructions for how graphics look, that was pre-compiled specifically for the original Switch's chip, the Tegra X1. So the game was really, really closely tied to that specific hardware.
Almost like it was hardwired to run only on that chip.
Kinda, yeah. So
Yeah.
getting that original game code, which expects the original driver setup and those specific shaders to run properly on the Switch 2's different hardware, that needs a really sophisticated compatibility layer.
Like a translation layer.
Exactly. Think of it like a complex translation happening constantly in real time. It's sort of similar conceptually to things like Proton you see on PC for running Windows games on Linux, but maybe even trickier because of how close to the metal those Switch 1 games were built.
And that's the layer where things can go wrong, where games might break.
That's precisely it. That's where you could hit unexpected problems, leading to those startup failures or the issues seen after launch in those basic tests.
So even though that 2.5% number from the automated tests sounds low.
Right. The potential for more games having, let's say, minor graphical issues or performance hiccups, or even more serious gameplay bugs when they're actually played by humans,
Yeah.
that's still kind of an open question until the console is out there in the wild.
Gotcha. Were there any particular third-party games that came up in discussions as being maybe problematic or ones expected to need patches?
Yeah, a few names popped up. Things like Doom Eternal, Wolfenstein II, graphically intense games. Also Rocket League, Mega Man Legacy Collection, Dead by Daylight.
Yeah, online games too.
Yeah, and some others like OKO, Simran Gagura Reflections, Arcade Archives, Dig Dug, the original Final Fantasy, Travis Strikes Again. These were mentioned as titles that might have quirks or potentially need specific updates or maybe even dedicated Switch 2 versions down the line.
Especially for those big online games like Rocket League or Dead by Daylight. Players probably want enhanced versions anyway,
For
right?
sure, yeah. People were already hoping for performance boosts there.
Okay, so let's sum up the compatibility picture for the main Switch 1 library. It sounds like very high numbers past the basic checks, especially Nintendo's own games. That's promising.
Definitely promising.
But the big unknown is how many of the, thousands and thousands of third-party games actually play smoothly, because most haven't really been tested for that yet. It leaves a question mark over that huge long tail of games.
That's the key takeaway, I think. The headline number looks good, but the depth of testing so far means there's still some uncertainty, especially if you have a really big, diverse library with niche titles.
Which is why some people are saying, maybe hold on to your original Switch, at least for a bit.
Yeah, that's come up in
All right, okay. Let's shift gears then. Moving beyond just making games work, what about making them work better? Games being enhanced by the Switch 2's power.
Yeah, this is where things get really exciting, seeing what that extra horsepower can do. And the prime examples that keep coming up are, unsurprisingly, The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom.
Makes sense. A lot of people felt those games, amazing as they are, were kind of held back by the original Switch hardware, didn't they?
Absolutely. Things like the frame rate, it could get pretty choppy in busy areas like Korok Forest or villages. And the resolution wasn't always super sharp, especially docked.
I definitely remember that feeling, running into Kakariko Village and just feeling the slowdown. So what's it like playing these on the Switch 2, based on the impressions we've seen?
People are describing it as a dramatic transformation. Visually, the difference sounds really striking. Colors are apparently more vibrant. The lighting is noticeably better. You get clear HDR effects.
HDR, okay.
Yeah, sharper details overall, better water effects, and those environments, even places like Korok Forest that struggled before, they feel more detailed, more alive.
And the performance, that was the big one for a lot of players.
Huge jump. Reports are saying they can run at a smooth 60 frames per second.
60, wow.
Yeah, apparently even at 4K resolution when the console is docked.
4K 60 FPS Zelda. That's huge.
It is. And even in handheld mode, the display, apparently it's an LCD, not OLED, but still it looks great with better colors and brightness than the original Switch screen. And that consistent 60 FPS, it just makes the controls feel way more responsive. Everything feels snappier.
A stable 60 frames per second while exploring Hyrule. I mean, that sounds like a dream come true for anyone who sank hundreds of hours into those games on the original.
It really changes the fundamental feel, doesn't it? Exploration, combat, just moving around. But maybe one of the biggest impacts reported is the load times.
Oh, how so?
They're described as almost instantaneous, like fast traveling across the map, pulling up your inventory, opening the Pura Pad. It just happens immediately.
No more waiting screens, basically.
Pretty much gone. It just removes all that friction, makes the game flow so much better. It genuinely sounds like a different, faster kind of experience.
So, people who've tried these enhanced versions, they're finding it tough to go back to the originals.
That's definitely the vibe. They're calling them the definitive way to play these two massive games. Apparently, there's even a new Zelda Notes app bundled in with these versions, too.
Oh, what's that?
It sounds like an in-game resource for lore, character details, history, that kind of thing. Fans seem to think it's a pretty cool addition.
Nice little bonus.
Yeah.
So how does this work? If you already own, say, Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, how do you get this enhanced version?
Okay, so the way it seems to work is, If you own the original game, physically or digitally, and you subscribe to the Nintendo Switch Online Expansion Pack, that's the pricier tier of their online service.
Right, the one with N64 games and stuff.
Exactly. If you have that, you get the upgrade to the enhanced Switch 2 version for free.
Okay, free upgrade for expansion pack members. What if you own the game but don't subscribe to that tier?
Then there seems to be a $10 fee to upgrade to the enhanced version.
$10. Okay. And if you're buying the game fresh on Switch 2? Haven't played it before.
The reported full retail price for these enhanced ports is $80.
$80.
Yeah, there's some commentary around that. While the technical upgrades sound genuinely impressive, that price point feels a bit steep to some for games that, originally launched on the previous console, even with the enhancements. It's a point of discussion, especially for new buyers.
Gotcha. Okay, let's move on from specific game upgrades and look at the broader picture for Nintendo's classic game library, the stuff offered through Nintendo Classics, part of Nintendo Switch Online. How does the Switch 2 affect that?
Yeah, this area sees some really interesting changes, especially for the N64 app within Nintendo Classics. There are some specific new features coming, and the key thing is they seem to be exclusive to the Switch too.
Exclusive N64 features. Like what?
Well, first up, there's a new CRT filter, to make it look like an old TV screen. Apparently, it looks much better and more convincing because it can be rendered at 4K resolution on the Switch 2.
Okay, better CRT filter. What else?
Crucially, button remapping for each individual N64 game.
Oh, finally. That's been hugely requested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially for some of those weird N64 controller layouts.
Exactly. A big quality of life win. And lastly, a rewind feature. Now, other NSO retro apps have had this, but it's apparently new specifically for the N64 library, and again, only on Switch 2.
Okay, rewind is nice, button remapping is great. But hang on. Why would something like button remapping be exclusive to the Switch 2? Surely the original Switch could handle that technically.
And that's where the debate really fires up. This is a major point people are raising. Some strongly feel this exclusivity, especially for button mapping, is purely a business move by Nintendo.
Just to push people to upgrade.
That's the argument, yeah. To make the Switch 2 seem more valuable, give you another reason to buy it. They point out that features like button remapping are standard in PC emulators and just don't seem technically demanding for the original Switch hardware.
So it's seen as an artificial limitation by some.
That's one very common perspective. Now, the counter-argument, the one suggesting maybe there are technical reasons, tends to focus more on things like the rewind feature.
How so?
Well, rewinding involves constantly saving and loading snapshots of the game's state. N64 game states are much bigger and more complex than, say, NES game states. So the theory goes that maybe the rewind feature specifically needs more CPU power or RAM than the original Switch could consistently provide for N64 emulation without causing performance issues.
Okay, maybe rewind is demanding.
And similarly, for the CRT filter, a really high-quality one just looks way, way better at 4K, which the original Switch can't output. So maybe some features do benefit significantly from the new hardware.
But button mapping still feels like the odd one out there.
Right. It does seem like the hardest one to justify technically for exclusivity, which fuels that it's just business argument.
What about other stuff people still want for Nintendo Classics? Any movement there?
Oh, the wish list is always long. People still want simple things like plain black borders as a display option instead of those static background images, especially with OLED screens and burn-in concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And of course, specific games are always requested. Donkey Kong 64, Ogre Battle 64 keep coming up. Memory pack support is another big one for saving things like ghost data in Mario Kart 64.
Right, for those extra features.
And looking at online play, there's always hope for better netcode, maybe moving towards something like rollback for a smoother experience in those classic multiplayer games.
So for the N64 library on Switch 2, we get some nice new features, but the current info ties them to the new console, sparking that whole debate about why. Even if there's maybe a slight possibility, button mapping could come to Switch 1 N64 later on.
Right, but the initial information points strongly towards Switch 2 exclusivity for these new N64 enhancements. That's the clear picture for now.
Okay. Which brings us to maybe the biggest deal and also the most controversial part of Nintendo Classics on Switch 2, GameCube games.
Yeah, this is definitely the headline addition to the service for the new console. It's finally happening.
GameCube games are officially coming to Nintendo Classics.
That's what the reports indicate. And we even have a list of some confirmed titles that are part of the initial launch lineup for the service on Switch 2.
Oh, nice. Which games are confirmed?
The ones mentioned include Mario Super Strikers, The Legend of Zelda, Wind Waker, the amazing F-Zero GX, and Soul Calibur 2.
Wow, F-Zero GX. That's huge.
Yeah, big fan favorites in there. In total, about 10 GameCube games have been mentioned as being confirmed, also including Pokemon Colosseum and Luigi's Mansion.
Okay, a solid starting lineup. How are these games being presented on Switch 2? Are they just basic ports?
No, they're getting some nice enhancements. Reports mention things like improved resolution, significantly faster load times, widescreen support where it makes sense for the game,
Why the Green is great.
and importantly, online play is being added for multiplayer titles, plus they'll have those retro screen filter options we talked about earlier.
So similar enhancements to the N64 stuff, but for GameCube.
Pretty much. And again, people are saying these are likely going to be the definitive way to play these classics now, unless there is already an HD remaster like Wind Waker HD on Wii U. Games like F-Zero GX and Soul Calibur 2 are specifically mentioned as running at a stable 60 fps in widescreen.
60 FPS F-Zero GX and widescreen with online play. Okay, that sounds incredible.
It really does.
So, enhanced GameCube games, looking great, running great. Where's the controversy then? What's the catch?
The catch, and it's a big one that's causing a lot of debate, is exclusivity. To play these GameCube games via Nintendo Classics, you have to own a Switch 2 console. And you also have to be subscribed to the NSO expansion pack tier. They will simply not be available to play on the original Switch hardware through the service.
Okay, and that's fueling the debate about whether the original Switch could have actually run them.
Exactly. That's the core of the argument. One side says, look, the original Switch could have technically handled GameCube emulation. They often point to the NVIDIA Shield TV.
Right, uses the same basic chip, the Tegra X1.
Yeah. And the Shield can emulate some Wii games, which are generally seen as more demanding than GameCube. So the logic is, if the Shield can do Wii, surely the Switch could manage GameCube.
They also mention games the Switch did run, like Mario Sunshine or Metroid Prime Remastered.
Yeah. Right, though there's always that debate about whether those were true, efficient emulation, or more like resource-heavy remakes or recompilations built specifically for the Switch. It's not a perfect comparison.
Okay, so that's the it could have worked argument. What's the technical counter-argument? Why couldn't the original Switch handle it?
The counter-argument focuses on the fact that the Switch's version of that Tegra X1 chip was significantly underclocked compared to the version in the Shield.
To manage heat and battery life in a handheld.
Right,
Yes.
exactly. And they argue that proper, accurate GameCube emulation requires quite a bit of performance overhead. Getting that to run consistently well at decent resolutions across a wide range of GameCube games might just have been too much for the original Switch's throttled hardware.
So a genuine technical debate exists there about capability. But you mentioned that greed theory earlier, too. How does that fit with GameCube?
Well, this is where a lot of players ultimately land, and you hear this perspective very strongly. They believe that regardless of the precise technical limitations of the original Switch, making the highly anticipated GameCube library exclusive to Switch 2 is primarily a strategic business decision by Nintendo. Meaning, GameCube games are a huge carrot. Players have wanted them on Switch for years. By tying them exclusively to the new console and the premium expansion pack subscription, it creates a very powerful incentive to upgrade your hardware and pay for the higher service tier.
Maximizing revenue from the new generation and the subscription service.
That's the theory. It's seen by some as fitting a pattern where Nintendo strategically gates its most desirable legacy content behind new hardware purchases or premium service tiers, whether technically necessary or not.
So the bottom line for you, the listener, is getting access to this really sought-after GameCube library means buying into the new Switch 2 and paying for the expansion pack. Full stop.
That's the practical reality it presented. And it definitely creates frustration for players who feel they're being pushed into an expensive upgrade for content they suspect their current Switch might have been able to handle, leading to that whole debate. Technical limitations versus calculated business strategy.
So that's kind of the landscape as we see it for your existing game library heading into the Switch 2 era. It looks like the new console is shaping up to offer pretty strong backwards compatibility for most Switch 1 games.
Yeah, the vast majority seem okay based on initial checks.
It's going to deliver some really impressive enhancements for key titles, like those Zelda games we talked about.
Definitely making them the definitive versions.
And it's finally bringing that GameCube library, along with some nice upgrades for older retro classics, to a modern Nintendo system.
But as we've unpacked, it's not quite that simple, is it? There are nuances. Compatibility has technical hurdles, meaning it might not be perfect for every single game out there.
Right, especially the less common ones.
And that decision to lock not just the GameCube library, but also those new N64 features behind the Switch 2 and the expansion pack, that's a major point of friction and debate among players. Was it really necessary? Or was it just business?
What's really interesting to me here is seeing Nintendo juggle both sides. They're clearly putting in significant technical work, building that compatibility layer, enhancing existing games.
Yeah, that's not trivial engineering.
But at the same time, they're making very clear, very strategic choices about what content and features are going to be exclusive carrots to pull people onto the new hardware.
Which really leads to a big question for you to think about as you consider the Switch 2. How do these decisions, the mix of technical achievement and strategic exclusion, how does that shape the value of the Switch 2 for you personally? For your game library, your habits, your future purchases?
What does this whole approach maybe reveal about Nintendo's priorities, their philosophy as they move into this next hardware generation? Definitely gives us a lot to chew on while we wait for more news and the actual launch.